This is the start of making my corset with a busk. I am no corset making expert. I found the last one quite difficult to do. This pattern pieces are from one of my Jean Hannisett period costume books and slightly altered to fit me from a mock-up we did earlier. Everybody's body shapes are different, so these might not necessarily fit you, but they suit me, so I'll go on if you're wondering who Jean Hannisett is. This is one of her books, and this is where I got it from. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce the type of fabric this is, so I've just written it down. That's what it's called. It's very similar to a corset couture, but it's more like a upholstery jacquard, but it was really nice. It's got a lovely embroidered pattern on it. I'll be putting all links on my website to where I bought everything from. First of all, on all my pieces, I've overlocked the edges so it makes them all nice and neat. And I'm doing a front facing, so done the same on those as well. Okay, you need to buy a busk, and first of all I did a mock-up, so I already knew how long mine is, which is 34 centimetres long. When you measure for your busk, I sort of started about half an inch from the top and bottom, because later on I'll be putting some bias binding on the bottom and the top. Okay, starting with the fronts here, I've got my main piece and I've got a facing. You have to basically cut the facing to exactly the same piece as your main one here, but you don't need to have it quite as long. I could have cut this a bit shorter if I wanted to, but wanted a bit more to play with just in case. I'm making sure my facing is faced upwards, so the good side, and then I'll be taking the other good side of the main piece and putting that over the top. So you've got good side to good side. Okay, I'm working say about half an inch down and 1.5 centimetres in as the seam allowance from the edge. So just so I'm a bit more precise, I'm getting a ruler and I'm just marking 1.5 centimetres in by pencil, just for my own reference. Okay, I've put the loop side of the busk facing inwards, about that centimetre and a half in, and I've just used a fabric marker pen to draw a line between the loops. So that's between here and here, here and here, there and there, and then there to there, and there to there. Next I've started to sew down this line. I've started off with back stitching forwards and backwards at the top. Carried on, started on this blue line, went forwards and backwards 2 stitches, carried on to the end of the blue line, went back 2 stitches and then forwards 2 stitches. I then lift the foot up in the machine with the needle up and move to the next line here. So you don't need to stop and cut your thread and then start again. Just lift your needle up and your foot. And then the same again, I did a forwards backwards, carried on right to the end, forwards backwards, then stop, lift the foot up and the needle, then go into the next line, and do that for all the others. Okay, next turn it the right way out and give it a good press with the iron. Next I've put some pins in so that I don't go over my holes. I've put them at the start and at the finish of every hole. which is where the busk loops will come through eventually. Next thing I'm going to do is sew a line just a couple of millimeters in from the edge. Okay, I've started sewing 2 millimeters down from in the edge. I've reached the first pin and I've done a forwards and backwards stitch, and I've cut the thread and I'm leaving the tails. So make sure you leave a good amount on your tails. I'll see why after. Next thing we want to do is start sewing again from below the next hole. Don't sew over the hole. Start again there and then finish at your next pin. Do a back stitch, forward stitch, and then stop, take it out of the machine, cut and leave some tails, and do that on every single one. Okay, now so from each point you should have 2 tails sticking out roughly. All this where I put the pins, so here is like your hole where you didn't want to sew through. Now using a needle you have to take those tails you had sticking out this way and thread them through to the inside. So you can just see I've popped them through and pulled them out through the middle. I've done that for front and back tails and every single one. Next I'm inserting the busk by pushing it through the seams and pushing it through the holes that you made earlier, like so. And I'm just going to sew it in place, and I'm going to use a zip foot to help me do this because you've got to get quite close. So that's the edge of the busk just there. You want to sew just to the side of it, just so you don't obviously break your needle. If you go over the busk with your needle, it'll break. So I'm just going to be sewing down there to secure this in place. Okay, that's now been sewn in place. Next you want to take your other side to put your stud side in, putting right sides together again. Just place this near. Place this about the same distance in. Like so. And draw a line from the top on this inside here all the way to the bottom. You can just see I've done it earlier. Then placing the edge of this next to the edge of that, try and line up your loops with your studs. Put a little mark just inside of them. So, all the way down. So now I can take that away. Now they're measured up, and where that line is, I'm just going to sew right way down that line. Next, after you've sewn your line, you want to fold it in half again and give it a good press with the iron. Next you want to do exactly what you did on the other piece and just run a sewing stitch a couple of millimeters in from the edge. Okay, next where you've got your marks, you want to get a tool like this, an oar, and very carefully you poke holes through this flap here and this outer one, not through the back or through the back facing. You have to very carefully poke little holes through each one and then work the fabric over the silver studs gradually with your fingers, being very, very careful. So just start off with a small hole and then gradually get bigger. But you don't want to get a pair of scissors and cut little holes, because that will just cut the threads and eventually your piece will start to unravel over time. So just get yourself a device like this, and from the inside you can just see it here, where you put your marks. You want to make sure your hole comes about here from the edge. The next thing you want to do after you've pulled all your knobs through your holes is just run another sewing line here the other side of the busk using a zipper foot like you did this side to secure that in place. It should look like this if you've matched everything up and your marks add up. Okay, next you want to cut out your back facing and then sew that on. Remember to put good side to good side, pretty much like we did on the front facing earlier on. Sew that on and then, then turn it the right way and give it a good press with the iron. Next you want to sew all the rest of your corset pieces together, as this is just a one layer corset. Next, when you've ironed your facing flat to the inside, you want to just run another 2mm or 3mm row down of stitching onto the edge, just to give that extra strength. Next I'm sewing my bone casing in using some bias binding, and all I'm doing to start with is just sewing one side of the bias down onto this flap here. I'm not folding it over then going through all the layers, but you can do that. I'm just doing it this other way, so it's only going through those two flaps there. And I'm going to fold this over pretty much like I've done these. Fold it over and then sew down your side just a couple of millimeters in. Okay, so I've now sewn my casings down. Next we need to measure up our spiral boning, which will go down this seam, this seam, this seam, this seam, and we're using straights down the back. So I just need to measure up how long they will be, leaving your seam allowance at the top and bottom, because I'm going to be putting a bias binding on a bit later on. So just remember that. Next I'm sewing my bias binding onto my corset, and I'm starting with the bottom. So just take a piece of your bias, leave a couple of centimetres off the end for turning in, put it face down onto your good side of your corset, and sew it just a little bit above the edge, but just in from the crease of the bias. Then do that all the way along, and then again at the other end leave a couple of centimetres. And next turn to your inside of your corset and take your bias binding end and just turn it in. What I tend to do is I just catch stitching this in place first, and then take this corner, bend it in, and then you'd sort of fold it like that and try to tuck that little tail bit inside to neaten the corner off. It's a bit tricky to do while I'm trying to film at the same time, so I'll just show you in a minute. Next, just carry on doing little catch stitches onto the back, taking a bit of thread through the piece of fabric on the back to the bias. Careful not to go right through to the other side. Do that all the way along. Okay, next take your straight steels. I bought these from Cabba Design. They come pre-cut with rounded ends. I'd already measured them to make sure, and you just thread these in from the top down the two channels you did earlier, so you need one for each one. For the other channels, I'm just using spiral boning, so I'm just threading it through my channels now. Just quickly showing that bias binding on the end, all tucked in and neat. And next, just finish off doing the top in exactly the same way. And then you want to get some lacing cord. I recommend some proper lacing. I've got this from Benacava Design again. I recommend, if you've got some cord already, just to get your length so you know how much to order, if you have any spare just to play with. And I used a video on the internet called Lucy's Corsetry, she calls herself, and she shows you how to do this tutorial for lacing. She calls it bunny ears style. So if you search bunny ears, corset lacing, I'm sure you'll find her. And she shows you how to lace it, just to save me explaining it. But basically it's like an over-under technique. And then this is your waist point.